Hi guys, what's happening? And welcome to my review of my 2015 S1000RR. Now, I've had this bike for a little over a year now, and I've really got into the ins and outs of the bike, the good points, the bad points, and sort of everything collectively, and how I genuinely feel about this bike as a whole. Now, without going too much into it, let's talk about a few key points before we get started. Now, the S1000RR on my setup currently has a set of 200 by 60 rear tyres. Now, that's slightly different to the standard spec, which was a 190/55. The front is standard with a 120/70, and they both are sporting the Supercorsa SC1s. Now, while they're not the most traditional road tyre, for me personally, they're a great balance for me with a sort of more fast-paced ride. Now, with that in mind, let's get into some stats for this bike. Now, the stock figures on the 2015 S1000RR was an engine brake horsepower of 199, which is absolutely phenomenal. Now, that in itself translates into raw power, aggression, and more importantly, something you've really got to harness and understand that this little twist here can lead to so much in terms of your speed and acceleration. Now, whilst it does in fact boast a huge amount of power with a small twist of the wrist, you have got to understand that this is a fly-by-wire, so it's a very smooth progression of the acceleration and the power delivery that it has. Now, of course, the quicker you do that, the more power is going to be delivered in a short space of time. But overall, the fly-by-wire system gives it such an ergonomic and smooth feel with the throttle. It's better than those of traditionals of that time, such as the R1 and the ZX10R, which were sporting the old school traditional cable throttle. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. You can still get smoothness, but nowhere near as much as you can with a fly-by-wire. Now, on the topic of the electronic setup with the throttle, for example, this bike boasts a huge amount of electronics, from the ABS to cornering ABS, from traction control to dynamic traction control. Now, how this translates is very simple. The more you grab that front brake, the more it's going to impact the ABS system. Now, that goes for straight line as well as cornering ABS. Now, if you grab that front brake in a corner, say you're at 20, 25 degrees banked over, and you've not got the ABS on, you will lose that front end, especially in sort of colder and wetter environments. Now, thanks to the electronics and technology within this bike, in the corner, it will just throttle back a little bit on that braking system because it understands what angle you're leant over at. Now, in turn, what that means is it keeps you on the bike and stops you from losing the front end and getting thrown halfway down the road. As happened to me a couple of months back, because I decided to turn the ABS off while it was hammering down with rain. It was freezing cold, and it just wasn't the best of conditions to be doing it. Now, the traction control works in a very similar format. Now, of course, depending on what mode you're in, whether it be road mode, race mode, or even if you're in your slick mode or your user mode, which is fully customizable, the traction control works in a very similar fashion. If you've not got enough grip on the rear and that wheel begins to spin, the traction control kicks in to save you from losing the back end and just cuts the power temporarily until it's stabilized again, and then allows you to continue on with the progression of power. Now, when you're banked into a corner and you open up that throttle, thanks again to the technology and the brain of this bike, it will allow you to have a little bit of power, but it will keep the power at such a point that it doesn't spin and send you off either on a high side or losing the bike and going onto a low side. For all intents and purposes, it's an incredibly intelligent system and does everything possible, not only to allow you to have fun with the bike, but also to keep you safe the entire time, which I think is brilliant, especially for a bike that's now 11 years old. It was sort of the first in its era to be bringing all of this incredibly intelligent technology to motorcycles on the road. Typically, you would have only ever seen this in the MotoGP and the real high-end racing. But as with all things when it comes to racing, the technology at the top slowly filters its way down to the road market. Now, the next 2 points is actually one of the biggest reasons that I personally went for this bike. It has a quick shifter built into it, which essentially means while you're constant on the throttle, you can shift up in the gears without having to roll off and without having to engage the clutch at any point. It essentially is a slap-through system. So you hold the throttle and you can keep shifting through the gears, no issue at all. Now, the second thing that I absolutely love about this bike, and was why I went for this bike over the likes of the R1 or the ZX10R, is it has what's called a blipper. Essentially, what that means is whilst you're off the throttle, you can go down the gears without having to engage the clutch at any point. It's a completely seamless system. With exceptions to red lights and some really tight turns, you can essentially put this bike into first gear, clutch out, and you don't have to touch that clutch until you come to a complete stop or you want to go into neutral. Now, the R1 for this year didn't have that. The ZX10 for this year didn't have that. BMW really were ahead of the curve when it comes to the technology and electronics that they put into their road motorcycles. And for me personally, even to this day, BMW have got the best electronic setup of all the brands out there. Now, how does this translate really to a day-to-day ride? Now, we're taking this as a road bike, and one thing you want from a road bike is comfort, practicality, and convenience. Now, the convenience of having a blipper is so much less intensive on that forearm on the left hand. It's also a lot easier to ride around. You don't have to think as much about what you need to do when it comes to slowing down and also when it comes to speeding up. So let's talk on how this bike really feels to ride. Now, we've gone through the electronics and the safety systems and how they kind of translate into what is a real world environment. Now we look at the weight of the vehicle itself. Now, there was a slight weight reduction from the previous model. You're talking sub 200 kilos, which for any superbike is very light to have. You look at the likes of the newer models, for example, you're talking 204 kilos, which is quite a lot of weight. And when you compare it to the brake horsepower, it's kind of 1-to-1 when you look at 1,000 brake per ton. So they're incredibly fast machines. Now, to keep it plain and simple, this translates into a lighter model, which also then goes further on to making it a little bit easier to transition between your left banking into your right banking. It makes it a lot easier to ride in and around the corners, whether it's roundabouts or nice long sweeping bends, and even more so on track. The one thing you want along with the power is the ability to flick it between the corners seamlessly, and that's what this bike does fantastically well. Now, there is one thing to note: when you are on the power, it gives you that ability to flick it over a little bit easier. So with the fly-by-wire system, the introduction of that on top of being able to transition to a different type of angle, whether it's going from left to right or from upright into a right-hand corner, is so seamless. It is one of the most comfortable bikes I've ever been on when it comes to the transition of angling. Now, when it comes to power delivery and how well that transitions to turning, the next thing you need is a good braking system. Now, coupled with the intelligence of this bike when it comes to your ABS and your cornering ABS, it really does boast a huge amount of braking power. Now, these have Brembo as standard for the front and for the rear. You have a dual caliper setup at the front and a standard single caliper setup for the rear. Now, not only are these an amazing set of brakes for the front and the rear, Brembos have always been top of the game for their caliper systems. Now, I sport the EBC pads and discs in this bike, and I think it complements them really well. The grip is fantastic, the feedback is always there, and a small amount of pressure gives you a huge amount of bite. BMW have absolutely nailed their setup with this bike when it comes to the braking capacity. Now, obviously, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. The harder you go, the more braking pressure that gets exerted into the disc, and it slows you down a lot more. Now, with the ABS in itself, if you put too much in, it cuts in and out as standard. Same on a straight line as it will do in a corner. It's almost the perfect setup to go from street riding and even into track riding, because if I'm being perfectly honest, the only thing you're ever going to change in the setup of this bike, unless you're really chasing tenths of a second, is going to be the discs and the pads that you put in there. So unless you're riding track 24/7 on these, you're not going to be using those types of pads on the road, for example. You're not going to be using ceramic setups. You're going to be using your sintered pads. You're going to be using everything along those lines. And it's just a great setup all round. For me personally, the confidence I get off of using this system is second to none. Now, although you have the Brembo at the front and the Brembo at the rear, you do have a standard Nissin front master cylinder. Now, typically I would say Brembo master cylinder all day, but if I'm being perfectly honest, the difference between this standard setup and an RC19, for example, is not a huge amount. It's a couple of mil realistically before you start to feel the bite. And obviously, the hotter the discs are and the hotter the pads are, the quicker you're going to get that bite. Now, from a cold setup, yes, I will say that the RC19 is a slightly better setup, but of course that's an aftermarket thing that you put in there. It's not something that comes standard on these bikes. It's an 11-year-old model, and obviously they only had the technology available then, what they put on these standard. Now, in terms of technology and things that they were exceeding in at that time, this bike has a huge amount of road and riding modes. Now, there was an additional mode you could put into this, which included a chip which had to be installed to the bike. So let's start from the least powerful all the way through to a fully customizable setup. Now, the least powerful setup you had on this bike was what was called rain mode. Now, essentially it would restrict the throttle to 80%, and it would also bring that brake horsepower output down and keep you as safe as possible in really wet and poor conditions. The ABS would be put to its maximum, the same with the traction, and the DTC, that would be put to a +7 setting. Now, the next mode up from that was your road mode. Now, this would enable the front wheel to lift slightly, give you a little bit more power, and be less intrusive on your brake system and your traction control system. The next mode up from this in terms of power was your race mode. Now, that done the exact same again. It reduced the ABS, reduced the traction, and it allowed the front wheel to lift a little bit more, giving you more power delivery. It was essentially cutting the power out less, which is what all of these modes do as they go. The braking and the DTC come down in terms of their effect, and the power delivery in the front wheel lift goes up in their effect. So it gives you more power constantly through. Now, what you could do with this bike was phenomenal when it comes to the custom riding mode. You can control the braking, so the engine braking itself, how intrusive you wanted that to be, the traction control, the DTC, There was so much you could control on this bike, and you could customize every individual element. So if you wanted real harsh engine braking, you could put the engine braking in rain mode. If you wanted the front wheel to be lifting as high as possible, you could put it into slick mode, which essentially was off. So you could have that go the whole way back. Now, one point to note on the slick mode is it was an aftermarket option from BMW. Now, there was a chip you had to buy which goes underneath this seat and plugs into the unit and gave you the slick mode. Now, the big question is, what is this bike like on a day-to-day? Now, I wouldn't say it's a daily ride because it really isn't. After 30 to 40 minutes in the saddle, you are going to start to notice a little bit of pain when it comes to the inside of the quads, small amount on the wrists, but more importantly, that bit right there. When you're sat in this seat for more than 30 to 40 minutes, it's not a comfort bike. It's not designed for day-to-day riding, touring all over the place. This seat does get uncomfortable after a while. As far as seats go for super bikes, especially for that generation, brilliant. And yes, you can get aftermarket changes, you can have different padding put into your seat and all that sort of stuff, but this seat is perfect for this bike. It's great for the race feel, it's great for the street feel, but it's not great for a day-to-day use. This really is a 2 or 3 days a week bike, but it really isn't a daily. Would I commute to this on work if I was doing 10, 15 miles a day? Perhaps. But would I do it if I was having to travel 30, 40 minutes a day? The truthful answer is no. I wouldn't be able to do that because it's just not that comfortable to be doing that. This really is a weekend bit of fun, and it's exactly what I use it for, which is the weekends and to really have a blast around with my friends here and there. So let's talk about the aesthetics of the bike. Now, obviously we can see this is not a standard BMW design. This is fully custom in terms of the decals and the way it's set up, but the fairings themselves are the exact same shape. They're the same cuts, the same mounting points. It's the exact same as the stock side of things. Now, notable differences between the Gen 2 and the Gen 3. The headlights were swapped over. So the large headlight went from the kickstand side to the offside, and the small light from the offside to the kickstand side. They also changed shape of them. So instead of having a round shape, they went for a more oval shape for the small headlight, and they extended the length of the longer headlight when they flipped them over. Now, I think this looks worlds better than the Gen 2 in terms of the headlight being offset. The fact that they went away from the symmetrical design and really kind of stood out as the first people to do something like that, I think it's worked really well. And I think it's what set them apart visually from all the other brands at the time. And even today, I don't think you see that many bikes now with the style of what they did with the Gen 3. I think BMW made a real good change with that. And as they went away from that as time got on, I think they've kind of lost touch a little bit there. It's too symmetrical, it's too refined. This, for me, was the best designed RR that they'd ever brought out. The lines and design, the gills at the side, it really gave it that shark feel, which obviously perfectly complements the design I've got on here. But they kind of added that aggressive gill from the original on the Gen 2, where it was nowhere near as aggressive, and they really stood out with the sharp lines and the aggressive tones that they've matched the entire way through this bike, whether it be from the gills at the front to the tail at the back, the sharp lines and cuts in the lights. It just looked absolutely perfect, and it's one where BMW really nailed the look. Now, one thing to note is the instrument cluster. Now, for someone who's just got onto this bike, if you've been like me and you've never had a bike with all of this sort of cluster and your old school analog dials and no ABS and traction and all that good stuff, it is really confusing to start off with. It essentially can tell you your lean angle, which I think is really cool. It tells you how much pressure you're exerting into the brakes in comparison to how quick that's slowing you down meters per second. It tells you your speed, it tells you the rev count you're at. It's got everything on a digital dash. Now, that can be really confusing at the start, but once you sort of break it down bit by bit, it becomes really easy to manage. It becomes seamless, and it's really good to get some feedback from it. You know exactly where you are, where the bike is. You basically know everything about it, and there's not much else you really need to be looking at when it comes to looking down there to translate to what you're seeing and feeling as you're riding. Now, with high performance bikes comes high performance maintenance, and what I mean by that is it's not necessarily going to cost you an arm and a leg if you're sensible with your maintenance schedule with this bike. Now, BMW recommend that you service this every 6,000 miles or annually, of course, whichever comes first. Me personally, I do mine every 3,000 miles just because of the type of riding that this bike goes through. It's a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more fast-paced than your standard day-to-day riding. Valve clearances are recommended every 18,000 miles. This bike is now due its valve clearances, which is going to get done in the next couple of weeks because it's at the point where it's hit the mileage and they need to be checked. Now, the bike itself still performs amazingly well. There's no issues with it, but it's just something you want to get checked for peace of mind to make sure that everything's ticking over as it should be. Now, things that I'm not too keen on this bike, being completely transparent. Now, the first thing that really does sort of grip me and really annoy me every now and again is how light the front end is. I've played around with the steering damper, the suspension. I've had this set up for my weight and everything like that, so it's all perfectly set for me. When you're on the power, yes, you're going to notice a little bit of a lift in grip on the front side, but this bike becomes incredibly light on the front because the weight is really set more towards the center mass of the vehicle and backwards. That translates into a real light front end, especially under power. When you're really going for it, even tucked in the bubble with all the aerodynamics of the bike, you really do feel a light end. Now it can be combated by adding some additional weights into the bars. I tried it, still didn't quite do it for me. It didn't give me the confidence in that front end. Now you do only notice it at speeds of 100, 110 upwards, but don't notice it at anything under that. So for road riding, it's absolutely fine. It's only really on the track where that sorts to play a bit of an issue. Cam chain. Now the cam chain on this bike is a self-tightening cam chain. Think of it as a spring pin that constantly pushes out against the cam chain guide and keeps it nice and taut. Now over time, like any pins, they slowly start to wear and the cam chain can start to rattle. Now that can be catastrophic for your engine. So what a lot of people do is they replace that part for a manual cam chain tensioner, and something you should definitely do, or at least consider doing, if you're getting an S1000RR. The last thing you want is to have that, go out on a nice blast for months on end, and then all of a sudden that starts to come loose, you don't check it, and things go sideways. Overall, would I recommend the Gen 3 S1000RR to somebody else who's looking to get their first big bike or their first super bike? And the answer is yes, clear as day. For the options of this generation, whether it be the R1 for that year, the GX 1000, the ZX10, or even this, the S1000RR, of all of those models available, I'd be choosing the BMW every day of the week. And if you ask me if I'd do it again, it would be a yes. This bike for me really, well and truly was the pinnacle for 1000cc super bikes at that time, and it still holds its own today, 11 years later. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you found this video beneficial. And if you've got any questions specifically relating to this bike or any other questions relating to why I chose this over other models, please do feel free to drop a comment below or send me a message direct and I'll give you my honest answer to any questions you might have. Other than that, thank you guys for watching. Take care and I'll see you soon.